Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Bringing Water to Life webinar series, Agriculture's Water Challenges, Solutions from the Experts. My name is John Farner. I'm with the Irrigation Association. Really excited about today's webinar, and I apologize. We're getting started 3 minutes late. I always like to keep these things dead on. Had a little technical hiccup with our audio, but I think we're good to go now for a smooth webinar. For those of you who attended our irrigation shows in the past, we've had our drought summits as well as a water summit last year in Orlando. And what we've done this year is we're not going to do those again at our irrigation show. We're going to have more interactive discussions during our webinars. So this webinar is going to be different than any other of our webinars we've had in the past. This is a true panel discussion where I'm going to have some slides that will show so you can visualize on the screen what we're talking about. But our panelists do not have long prepared presentations for you. We're going to ask them to make a few opening remarks, who they are, where they're from, what their perspective is on agricultural irrigation, and then just dive right into some prepared questions that I have for the panelists as the moderator. And what I really want to do is just drive discussion among our panelists as well as the audience. So we're going to go through just a few housekeeping before the webinar begins. Those of you who have participated in our webinars have seen this slide in the past. I haven't changed it in a couple of years. This webinar is being recorded. So to view and listen to the recording, just visit irrigation.org/webinar series. This is going to be open to the public free of charge on the Irrigation Association's YouTube page and linked from our website at that link. If you have any questions during the webinar for myself, for our panelists, if anything pops up that interests you, you want to dive into other things, or just some questions you have off the bat about your area and what you're seeing on ag irrigation that you'd like the folks on the panel to respond to, just go ahead and type it in the toolbar. I'm going to be looking at those questions throughout the webinar, keep track of them, and when the time arises to have those questions interjected into the discussion, I would love to do that. I would love for the questions to be driven by our participants. Knowing I have some in front of me now that it can last for well more than an hour, even though we'll keep it to 60 minutes, I want a lot of it to be driven by those participating in the webinar. And finally, there are CEUs available for this webinar. That information is available on our website, irrigation.org/webinar_series. If you are participating right now and you want to get CEUs, we do have record of your attendance if you're dialed in right now. If you're listening on a recording, just keep reference on the date and time you listen to the recording and which webinar it was, so you have it for your records if and when you do get that magic letter in the mail that you're audited for your CEUs. Now, before I open discussion to the webinar participants, I just want to kind of go over generally what we're looking at here when it comes to agricultural irrigation. In front of you is a chart that I love using when talking about agricultural irrigation, and that is irrigated acres in the United States. So you can see the top 5 pretty much stick out at you right away, the darker shades of green. So you have Nebraska and California, you have Idaho and Texas and Arkansas. So by acres, those are the top 5 with irrigated acres in the United States. It's not to mention that others are very important states like Kansas, Colorado, Utah, Washington, Oregon, etc. All very important, but just looking at this, you can see what the top 5 are. Now, what's more interesting than this map is this map here. This talks about the percent of the farmland that is irrigated. So when you look at this top 5 states, all of a sudden some of those become a lighter shade. So this being blue, the states like Texas has a lot of agriculture in that state, a lot. But even though irrigation is very important to the state, the percentage is lower. A lot of ranch land down there, etc. But then you look at the percentages where you do see an increase. Are states like Arkansas and Mississippi is a very dark shade of blue. Mississippi didn't register as one of the top irrigated states in the United States, but those acres that are farmland in Mississippi, more than 60% are irrigated. So which I find very interesting. And then you have states like California, Idaho, again, has a darker shade of blue as well. But again, it just shows the disparity, or not the disparity, the differences when it comes to total acreage versus percentage of farmland that is irrigated in each state. And then also interesting is the percent increase. Now, you look at the western part of the United States, a lot of that is irrigated. So you take draw a line down the middle of the United States, starting with the Dakotas down through Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, that being the 100th meridian and going west. That's 17 western states, highly irrigated states when thinking of agriculture. So there's not much room to grow in those states when it comes to increasing the acreage of land. But then you look at from 1997 to 2013, the percentage of increases in irrigated farmland throughout the United States. States like Tennessee has a 213% increase, where states like Indiana, 78% increase. And then Mississippi, 53%, et cetera. I'm not going to go through each one. You can see where you've had a significant amount of increase in a lot of the eastern part of the United States over that span of 1997 and 2013. So it's not what we used to think of just irrigated agriculture in the West. It is everywhere. And that's why as an industry, we like to think of this more holistically than what we have in the past, that irrigation is important throughout the United States. We see water issues occurring everywhere. We need to learn from one another what issues are popping up in other states, so we're readily prepared where we are to react and respond and get out in front of those water issues affecting our states. And the last slide I'll show before I introduce our panel is this one here. This is getting kind of dated as it ends in 2008, but it tells a good story still. So this chart goes from 1961 to 2008 and focuses on globally farmland. So if you look, that's why it's in hectares, not in acres. So in 1961, if you look at 1,400 million hectares of land, okay, it's either rain-fed or irrigated globally, okay? The green shade is rain-fed and the blue shade is irrigated. So from 61 to 2008, you see an increase in irrigated land, but not significant, okay? Rain-fed, same thing. You see a little bit of an increase and a decrease, but it pretty much stays the same. And then the overall acreage has increased over time, but not a lot when you think of that span of time from 61 to 2008. What has changed drastically is cropland per person. So those of us who were alive and well in 1961 had about 0.45, almost a half a hectare to your name for the food you eat, the clothes you wear, the energy you consume, whatever yield produces. That was yours, essentially, globally. Fast forward to 2008, that has decreased by more than half. So in between 0.20 and 0.25 hectares for your name. That means we need to be much more productive with the land we have globally to meet the needs of our population. Again, whether it's food, whether it's feed, or clothes, or if it's for energy. It's very important to be more productive because we have less cropland per person than we had years ago. So I'll just stop there and I'm going to introduce our panelists. You'll see our information up on the screen there. We have Jay Robbins with Irrigation Mart. We have Paul McFadden with the Toro Company and Stephen Smith with Wade Water. When we were putting together this webinar, we were very interested in having a very knowledgeable group of folks join us for this webinar, and folks that I've personally worked with in the past on a wide variety of issues. Both Jay and Stephen are past presidents of the Irrigation Association. Paul is a past chairman of the Government Affairs Committee, past president of the California Ag Irrigation Association. So each one of these guys have been very instrumental on the issues affecting not only their areas and their businesses, but our industry as a whole, given their experiences with the Irrigation Association. So I'm going to go in alphabetical order and start with Paul McFadden. Paul, do you want to talk a little bit about who you are, what you do with the Toro Company, and then we'll move on to Jay and Stephen before I start bombarding you guys with questions?
Sure. Thanks, John. Appreciate the introduction. So again, my name is Paul McFadden. I'm with the Toro Company. Toro Ag is the ag division based in El Cajon, where we manufacture micro and drip irrigation products for the ag space. We have 3 manufacturing sites in the U.S. and 6 or 7 in the world dedicated just to making ag irrigation products, efficient ag irrigation products. So we specialize in things like products such as drip tape for row crops. We have tree crops, vineyards, and nursery and greenhouse products, all under the Toro umbrella. Been with Toro about 5 years now, and my role with the company is sales, business development, and government affairs, handling some of the other programs such as the recycling program of drip irrigation products. So, thank you.
Thanks, Paul. So, Jay, you're up next, man. Tell us about Irrigation Mart, where you are, and where you do a lot of your business.
All right. Well, thanks, John. I'm Jay Robbins, as John said, and I'm with Irrigation Mart. I'm president of Irrigation Mart. We have 3 locations. I'm based in Ruston, Louisiana. We have a location in South Louisiana and one as well in South Texas. We specialize in ag irrigation, specifically drip micro, but we do center pivots and furrow irrigation work as well. We do have landscape divisions as well, so we do crossover not only in ag but in landscape, and do a variety of drainage projects as well. I'm a certified irrigation designer, and as John said, a past president of the Irrigation Association. Been involved with Paul and the Government Affairs Committee for a few years, working with legislatures both on the state and federal level, and trying to make sure that our voices are heard when it comes to water issues that affect our industry and our client base.
Great. And Stephen, talk a little bit about who you are and what you do, please.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah.
I'm a practicing irrigation engineer and water resources engineer. I'm based in northeastern Colorado. My world in recent years is really deeply embedded in irrigated agriculture issues. And that's not to say I'm an expert in so much as I'm a generalist in this overview. I'm head of the U.S. International Standards Organization Irrigation and Drainage Committee. I'm with the editorial staff at the IA for Irrigation Today, and then most recently I'm very much embedded with the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research and our efforts to create an irrigation innovation consortium. So that's the short story. Thank you, John.
Great, and I'm going to go into that consortium here in a little bit. So I don't want to talk about that too much up front. So we'll go in reverse order and stick with you, Stephen. The title of this webinar focuses on agriculture's water challenges. So I want to start right there and keep this big picture, and then we're going to dive in a little bit after that. But Stephen, in a very brief overview, what do you think are the biggest challenges facing irrigated agriculture from your experience right now?
Well, I think of most particularly the incredible pressure that senior ag irrigation water rights are under, primarily in the west of the 100th meridian. And these are pressures created largely by municipal industrial interests, and also some others who are looking for ways to keep water in the river and for ecological purposes, and all of this wants to be sustainable in some way. And so, to me, that frames up the largest umbrella of issues that I can think of. And I think as we talk a bit about technology, and I can do that now or later, John, but therein is some solutions, or at least opportunity to mitigate some of the pressures that I referred to.
I agree. I'm going to get to technologies a little bit later. So I'm glad you brought that up because that's one of the things that we're going to talk about after we talk about a few other things, because I think that was one we need to highlight, especially towards the end of the webinar. But I want to go to Jay real quick and get your perspective. What are the top issues facing irrigated agriculture from your perspective, Jay?
So we're dealing with mostly irrigation guys and issues that affect the southeastern part of the United States. And so water rights is definitely one issue. We have a lot of, especially in Texas and some of the more arid areas, even part of the south central part of the U.S., water rights is still an issue. You have growing communities buying up farm ground so that they have access to the water rights associated with that ground. Water quality for irrigation is another concern. We have a lot of mineral content in our water, so iron, calcium, boron, other manganese, other things that are in our water that can prove detrimental to either longevity of irrigation systems or crops as they're applied. Saltwater intrusion is another issue that we are seeing in many different areas, from Florida to even up into Arkansas. And then general water availability. So those are three of the big things that we're seeing and trying to determine how to fight those issues.
Great. And Paul, I'm ending with you on purpose because I want to transition your comments into the next question, but I'll ask this one first. What are the biggest challenges from your perspective facing irrigated agriculture?
So the biggest issues that face our customers and in us as industry professionals, in my opinion, is I think both my colleagues touched on it: water quality and water quantity. But I think one of the even more important issues that we hear back from farmers is labor. And I'm not going to go down that path, but the availability of labor is their top issue. Just being able to grow the crops and harvest the crops. Specifically towards water, it's water quantity and quality, as Jay and Stephen both mentioned. Specifically in California, 40% of all the water that falls on the state through rain or snow by law fills the rivers and streams for environmental benefits. The rest is divided into ag users, urban and industrial users. So coming on the heels of a 5-year drought, we had a very wet winter last 2 years ago. This winter is not near as good. The reservoirs are full, the streams and so forth are full, but the groundwater is still depleted. And so whether it's conveyance through pipelines, rivers, canals, or stored in reservoirs or stored in aquifers, those three pieces all have to not only be at equitable levels, but they have to be at good quality, as Jay mentioned, with saltwater intrusion or minerals or those kinds of things. Not only affects farmers, but there's a very high percentage of folks that get our water from groundwater. And for drinking water, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of, I think, 80%, 85% of all Californians utilize groundwater to some degree. So to kind of summarize, I think outside of labor, water quality and water quantity are the two biggest things that affect what we do.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned labor because that is one that's very front of mind in the news and in the news quite a bit. And I know that even looking at some of the folks who I recognize who are attending this webinar, labor is at a front of mind for them too. But it's something we need to keep in mind. Irrigation technologies are not going to solve our labor problem, of course, but it's something that we need to continue to think about and how what the future of agriculture is going to be, given the labor climate, so to speak, that we're in right now. But I want to stick with you, Paul, because you brought up the drought. The drought you all were in California, you being from California, and the current drought you're in right now. And I wanted to put up another slide here, which is the U.S. Drought Monitor. It's something that we focus on here at the Irrigation Association quite a bit. It's a great tool. The website's on the screen there. It's free of charge to view these drought monitors. And it's even as a snapshot in time, there are a lot of tools on there to look at where we've been as a nation with drought and where we are now. So you can see trends, you can see where a snapshot in time at any given point in time, where we were. But I know, Paul, you were very involved in the last drought in California, specifically working with the state to seek out opportunities to assist farmers to become more efficient with their water use. Now, efficiency can only bring you so far because when you have no water, you have no water. But again, going back to productivity and being as productive as possible with our land, we need to do all we can as an industry to help farmers be successful. So you want to talk a little bit about your experience there? I know you did a lot with the state on what was called sweep funding and discuss some of the successes and what that translated to in California.
Sure.
Yeah.
So in 2014, Governor Brown invited myself and one of my colleagues to Sacramento to help discuss possible solutions to the water issue through more efficient use of irrigation. And I think one of the things that during that process that was evidently clear, both working with the governor and his staff, as well as the Karen Ross, the Secretary of Food and Ag in the state of California, was that they were scrambling, trying to figure out where is all this water going and how can we improve it. Some may recall that the governor put in restrictions for the population, the urban population within the state, to save 1.2 million acre feet of water. Well, we went to Sacramento and we did some math, and we said, well, there's a lot of kind of some low-hanging fruit, if you will, that within the state of California, where there's a lot of drip and micro irrigation experience, that through taking crops that have been using that technology to farm for decades, in some cases, we could take that same technology and roll it over into the rest of that crop that, say, almonds, for example, that have not used. They've done an excellent job in converting, but there's still about a third of the million acres in the state of California that still flood irrigate. So if we could convert that along with a few others, we could easily save 1.2 million acre feet of water just in the ag community. And I think as part of that, there was a program, as you mentioned, John, the SWEEP program, which is California State Water Efficiency and Enhancement, to provide financial incentives or grants to operators to invest in water irrigation technologies or distribution center systems that save water and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that program has been going on since 2014, 2015, and to date, 587 projects covering over 109,000 acres have been awarded these grants to improve their efficiency, totaling just over $62 million. And then with that $62 million, farmers invested another $38 million. So it's $100 million that was invested in California agriculture in the last couple of years to become more efficient. As a result of that program, 166,000 metric tons, let me say that again, 166,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent has been removed from or prevented from going into the atmosphere. Roughly 35,000 cars, the equivalent, taken off the road for a year. And we've saved 39 billion gallons of water, enough to fill 57,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So the program has been incredibly successful for farmers in the state to save water, energy, reduce carbon greenhouse gas emissions, and ultimately to save water where we can use it in other areas of the state, including for the citizens. So, and they're talking about rolling out again this year somewhere in the neighborhood of $60 million additional funds to because the program has been so successful, to convert even more ag irrigation into efficient irrigation.
Paul, are you seeing, I just put up the close-up of the west part of the United States in terms of drought. Are you seeing, you hear in the news where you can weed through some of the big rhetoric that's out there and look at specifically how California is doing. Are you hearing anything about future restrictions in California or any kind of focus on conservation efforts once again, given the potential drought, not potential drought, but potential long-term drought that California may be entering now?
Sure, thanks. I think that if you can see the map there, most of California, most of the West is under abnormally dry to severe drought or extreme drought conditions, with the exception of parts of western Montana, Wyoming and Idaho, northern Idaho, and most of Washington State. But I think if you look at again, the three pillars of what we're doing in the state of California, the reservoirs are all full. They're, with the exception of Oroville, which had the spillway disaster that they've repaired, and now they're filling the reservoir back. But that's the state water project. So, that's currently at about 59% of capacity. Everything else is up, 90+% in terms of capacity to 100% of capacity. The groundwater situation is still in bad shape. So we're still pumping about 2.5 million acre feet a year more than is being replenished. And so there's some different things happening to help eliminate that, the SGMA Act and so forth, which we're going to talk about, I think, a little later. But
yeah, we are. Yeah.
The Department of Water Resources has already discussed 2 weeks ago re-implementing the restrictions, the drought restrictions that were in place prior to the wet winter we had a year ago. And I suspect they're going to be coming. The snowpack as of last week was only 37% of normal, which that's significant. That's like the only reservoir that of any size that really that Californians rely on for drinking water and for the environment. And even though we have storms coming this week and the snowpack is growing, it's still woefully below where we need to be.
Good. Yeah, we're going to definitely come back to groundwater as a whole, and specifically the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in California. But I wanted to bring in our other panelists here. Paul, you mentioned the SWEEP funding, and Stephen and Jay, both of you I know have been involved in the past with EQIP funding and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, EQIP, that program as a whole. And we'll start with Jay and then go to Stephen. Jay, what is the importance of these kinds of cost share programs to help farmers become more efficient with their water use?
Well, thanks, John. The EQIP program is used throughout the United States by producers for all different types of improvements on farm, for improving irrigation efficiency, for improving water storage capacity, for improving land to be more productive. The majority of the work that we've done with EQIP has been in the improving irrigation efficiency, whether that be making an investment to re-nozzle or put new sprinkler packages on center pivots, whether it be for land leveling or land grading, for furrow irrigation, or for investment in low pressure drip micro irrigation systems. And most of these growers utilize the funds as cost share to make these investments. And most of those growers would not be able to make those investments had they not had exterior funding mechanism to pick up part of that cost.
Stephen, do you want to give, I know that was a good overview. Do you have any other thoughts on the EQIP program you want to share?
I would just say that it is a huge incentive, as Jay mentioned, for farmer adoption of new technology. So it's a huge assistance to, let's call it, technology transfer generally. And I think the note here to be made for any of our listeners is that the NRCS EQIP program is administered state by state. So to learn for your state exactly what might entail a suitable practice, then that would be the place to start with your local NRCS specialist.
Very good. And so, Stephen and Jay, have you guys have both worked on EQIP projects personally, correct?
I have, and in fact, I adopted my own EQIP, my own project to an EQIP practices that were approved by State of Colorado NRCS group, and that was quite an insightful way to learn just exactly how the program works.
Great. And Jay, I know that you've even taken a step further. You are a technical service provider in some states for the EQIP program as well, which means that you've gotten your hands literally into projects and assisting farmers with meeting their conservation goals with some of these EQIP projects too, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, we've worked directly with NRCS, designing and overseeing installation of programs that have been partially funded through the EQIP program in about 8 different states.
And I think one of the most important things to mention here, again, is Stephen, you made it, is that the states administer these programs, which means that different states have different priorities. In some states, water quantity and water quality may not be as important as air quality. So you might see more money going into air quality than fencing or irrigation efficiency improvements. The best thing we can do there is look at opportunities to talk to individual states and promote the benefits and why they should focus on irrigation efficiencies. And Jay, has that been your experience as well?
Yes, it has. Sure.
Good. Good. So, Stephen, I want to stick with you real quick. You have a great perspective on Colorado, being from Colorado and the Colorado River Basin. Jay, I haven't thought about your neck of the woods yet, but I want to stick with Colorado real quick, and we'll go ahead and show a graph here. And this, again, a little dated because the dotted line right there is 2008, and I believe you may have seen this in the past before, Stephen. But a few years ago, there was a study, I believe, from the United States Geological Service that talked about the future water demand and the future projected water supply out of the Colorado River. And so the blue chart you see there is the water supply, and that is real numbers up until that 2008, 2010 timeframe. And then once you get past that, the shades of blue and red are projected. Now, no matter how the best and worst case scenario for each, the projected water demand is above the projected water supply of the Colorado River. So I just want to get your raw thoughts on this chart, Stephen, and your specific perspectives on ag irrigation in the Colorado River Basin, and then go into specific questions from there.
One of the things that I'm very excited about is some of the work that's being done in the Colorado River Basin and the creation of opportunities to have these disparate interests come together to talk. And, you know, a lot of times they will quickly find out that the opposing idea doesn't have the devil's horns that they might have thought. And so as people get to know each other within the ag community, the municipal community, the environmental community, then there's lots of opportunity for the disparate interests to come together, fund projects, and start to realize how some mutually attainable goals can be achieved. To me, this is the sociological and political aspect of this. Sometimes we'll see if Jay agrees with this, but sometimes the engineering can be easy compared to the sociological and political roadblocks or quagmires that can come about. But again, I'm quite enthusiastic about some of the work that's being done on the Colorado River to bring the disparate interests together for mutual cooperation.
Do you think that the pressure placed on irrigated agriculture in the Colorado River Basin to save the amount of water that is needed to meet the projected water demands in the future is one that's achievable, or do you feel there's too much pressure being placed on ag and not from other sources?
Well, I'm an optimist about the technology that can be brought to bear with some of this, and so that's just me. I'm an optimist that we'll get some of these problems worked out through the discussions that I referenced earlier, but also through implementation of technology. And then back to EQIP or other funding sources like SWEEP, it can be hugely important to help a farmer or an irrigator understand that here's an opportunity to reduce their labor, improve their crop quality, and implement a higher level of management that benefits in the ways that we're talking about here.
Paul, being from California, when those of us, especially out east, we think of the Colorado River Basin, you think of Colorado, of course, but then you may think of Nevada, you may think of Arizona. But California, in my opinion, is lost on some as being affected and being part of that Colorado River Basin. So how important is the decisions that are being made upstream in the Colorado River? How important is that to you, from your perspective, being from California, a lot of business in California?
Well, I think just from the state's perspective, people in San Diego County and the greater Los Angeles basin get a certain percentage of their water from the Colorado River. And I think that people outside of those areas, obviously San Diego gets more, but people outside those areas don't necessarily understand that water travels clear across the state, and we rely on it. I think about all the farming operations in Riverside and Imperial counties on the east side of the state. All of the winter vegetables and leafy greens that people consume in the U.S. come from the Imperial Valley. So not having water to farm those areas would dramatically affect not just folks in Southern California, but in the U.S. in general. So it's critically important.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned that, because even it's talking to some of the Irrigation Association members out east who get it completely. They understand the political dynamics that occur in California and the Colorado River Basin or the Ogallala Aquifer, then in Texas and in the Southeast. But if you're up here in Maryland and you're irrigating out on the Eastern Shore and you hear all this focus on it's always Nebraska, California, why are the California water issues so important to me? It's for those reasons you just talked about, Paul, and it's something that we as an industry need to do a better job of talking about, is that importance of what comes out of these states with significant water problems.
I think, John, if I could,
a
lot of folks, we rely on a healthy, safe food supply, and as not only environmental pressures, but political, regulatory, and labor issues continue to put pressure on farmers, not just in the West, but throughout the country. More and more farmers are moving not just to other states, but to other countries. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that we have to realize as a citizen of the country, that there's some trade-offs, and food grown in the U.S. versus food grown in any other country. You pick it, whether it's Canada, Mexico, or any place else. Even though they have to adhere to the same standards, is it something that we want to continue to allow to happen? Do we feel comfortable with that? That's a big question I think folks have to ask.
I agree. And I want to remind everybody in the webinar, if you have any questions, please type them into your question box in the GoToWebinar toolbox. We have about 18 minutes left of this webinar, and I want to be sure to get to anybody's questions who has them. There was a question typed in. I think it's a relevant question that we're talking about right now. Maybe we'll start with Jay on this response. But I'll try to read this verbatim. Are there other areas that are not in a drought that are adopting these ideas, technologies, and programs that we've discussed? The questioner is from a state like Michigan, But Jay, you're in an area that is not affected by drought as much as Colorado or California. So do you see that technology adoption is either slower, or you have more hurdles to overcome because you don't have this thing that is hovering over farmers to basically require them to become more efficient? Or do you see farmers willing to adopt these new technologies and try out new things that we've talked about here?
So I kind of chuckled a little bit when you put up the last drought monitor map, because up until about a month ago, Louisiana, Arkansas, and part of Mississippi were yellow and orange. And so just recently, and I had not seen this last one, but just recently we've actually come off that map. Mm-hmm. But if you look over into Mississippi and Alabama, Georgia, and then up the East Coast, you see little spots. So you're right. I mean, we're not typically thought of as much as the 11, 12 Western states are as being as drought stricken as some of those states are, but we do have our challenges, and as that drought map shows, I mean, it can change. What they consider to be a drought over here can change from month to month or 6 months down the road. But the one thing that's consistent is weather's always changing. Okay, and we do live in the humid southeast, so we do get a fair bit of rainfall. If we could spread it out over the growing season and get it just when we needed it, we probably wouldn't have to irrigate, but that's never the way that it goes. So yes, we do see a slower adoption of some of the technology, although when we do hit some of these, and our droughts typically are not as long term as the Western droughts are, of course. Ours are more short term, maybe 2-3 years. But if you remember back a few years ago, Atlanta was about to run out of water. And it wasn't too long ago that Dallas was also about to run out of drinking water. And there were lawsuits between Florida and Georgia over, I think it was the Flint River, but over the water flow through the river, and Florida wasn't getting enough because Georgia was holding back too much or taking out too much. And in times where we get stressed like that, yeah, we tend to adopt things more quickly. But I will say, with the newer, with the oncoming of the younger group, the younger farmers, they are a little more proactive in looking for better ways to do things, easier ways to do things, or more efficient ways to do things. We do have a little more resistance with some of the older farmers that are out there. But we do see recently, the last couple of years, a little more proactive approach to some of these growers in picking up the newer technology, whether it be moisture monitoring or automation or improved efficiencies, things of that nature.
Very good. Paul or Stephen, do you have any thoughts on that as well, with technology adoption in states you might not think of as being heavily constrained by water issues?
The younger farmers that I'm familiar with are very definitely easily adapting to new technologies, and sometimes they're bringing into irrigated agriculture a technology that really hasn't been perfected for irrigated agriculture. One example of that might be drones. We're seeing such a rapid acceptance of drone technology, and not just the aerial imagery that can be created, but these drones can be retrofitted with multispectral cameras so that we get a near infrared imagery. And that kind of technology is being adapted rapidly in both agriculture and landscapes. And the whole idea is that with frequent flyovers, you could conceivably spot a disease or pest or water long or water short circumstance and see it more quickly than if you're doing a on the ground investigation in the field. But I think some of those technologies we're going to see a rapid increase in those technologies, and I do believe that it's going to have an important means of creating new water in a way, or better managing our water supplies to address some of those problems that we had identified earlier during the webinar.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned drones, and I think this is a topic for future discussion, I believe, Stephen, and I know you and I have had some very preliminary conversations about doing some more focus on the use of drone technology specific to irrigation in the future. So folks should keep an eye on that. And we are getting more questions put in, and I want to get these as many of these answered as possible. The next one, I could take a crack at first, and then ask the panel as well. But the question is, are there any state or federal programs to identify on a farm-by-farm basis which are the most inefficient irrigation systems in those farms, to target the limited financial resources that programs like EQIP may have the biggest bang for the buck? Now, EQIP is a voluntary program, so there are not any federal inspectors going out there and identifying this farm is inefficient, this farm is efficient, you're okay, you're not okay, and looking at opportunities there. A farmer needs to decide whether he or she wants to enter into this agreement with the federal government. Same thing on a state basis, I'm assuming, Paul, specific to the SWEEP program. And then work with the NRCS staff or other technical experts to achieve the conservation plans associated with that. The closest thing that I would have to that is working with conservation organizations like the Nature Conservancy or Trout Unlimited, who are very knowledgeable in partnering with the federal government and the EQIP program, but they are looking at it from a strictly environmental perspective, not necessarily from a productivity perspective and what the future potential of the farmer can be when it comes to increased yield based on the amount of resources used to increase efficiency. The Nature Conservancy and Trout Unlimited know stream flows, environmental impacts of farms. They know in their areas which farms are pretty inefficient and where the greatest opportunities are where water savings can occur for the environment. And so they may reach out to some farmers and say, hey, if you're interested in increasing your irrigation efficiencies, we can pony up the second half of that 50% cost share, so it's zero cost to you. You just need to have this conservation plan for saving water that we need to enter into the EQIP program with. Do any of you guys have any thoughts on that question? That's the closest thing that I can have to answering that. Let's kind of throw it out there.
I think some of the programs that Trout Unlimited or the Nature Conservancy have implemented with the kind of cost share to add into the cost share equation for a farmer or rancher, these have gotten some wonderful press, and it'd be good for interested parties just to investigate some of those projects because everybody's come out ahead. The Trout Unlimited in one case that I know of, plus the farmer, and plus the implementation of EQIP funding to convert from essentially wild flooding to center pivot irrigation. Everybody enjoyed the project and came out ahead, and there's some wonderful examples of the type you described, John.
We have 9 minutes left, and there are a couple more questions here, but I want to make sure to touch on two topics, which I think is going to address some of the questions that have already been asked. One of them is on groundwater, other one's on technologies and practices, because I didn't want to have them slip away from us. Paul, you mentioned the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act out in California and the importance of that piece of legislation. And for those of you who are not familiar with this act, California, up until the most recent drought, when this act was passed by the legislature and signed into law by the governor, the use of groundwater was not regulated in California. I called it the Wild West. It's basically drill, baby, drill for water and see what happens. And as your surface water allocations went to zero, literally zero percentage, farmers looked to all possible avenues to meet the needs of their customers, of their customers for whatever they were growing, and groundwater was one of those opportunities. So do you want to talk about, very briefly, Paul, with our limited amount of time we have left, what this Groundwater Management Act, which requires farmers to measure groundwater usage, what that impact has been in California?
Sure. So as John mentioned, this is a relatively new legislation for the state of California. It actually was signed into law, Senate Bill 1319 by Governor Brown in September 16th of 2014. California was one of only 4 states in the union that did not measure groundwater. And it seems silly to think that we're going to measure or monitor a resource and utilize it, be a good steward of that resource when we're not measuring it. So that has now come into practice. In 1980, prior to this legislation, the Department of Water Resources identified 450 groundwater basins, distinct basins around the state. 40 of those, almost 10% of them, were in overdraft situation, or in other words, we're pumping more water out than is going back in, and 11 of those were in critical conditions where groundwater levels dropped between 50 and 100 feet, which is significant. And so the state is looking at that and saying, okay, of these 500 basins roughly today, how can we manage those within those watersheds to make them have basically a neutral impact, so that we're not over pumping or overdrafting, if you will, those situations, and creating things like subsidence where soil levels will actually fall, and where now today we have canals that are flowing literally uphill, reducing capacities to move water around the state. Or bridges are settling on top of canals where there was space before. Filtration stations or pump stations on concrete pads are literally now up in the air because of the ground subsidence. So there's all kinds of issues. You can go on and think about how that could affect various situations. But the important thing is now we're measuring it, and we have until 2020 to come up with those plans, 2022 for less critical basins. But California, under Governor Brown's leadership, has taken a very aggressive posture with creating a more balanced system, so that we're not in a situation where we can't replenish that groundwater at some point. It takes years, often decades, or even longer to replenish groundwater so that it can be reused again. As I mentioned earlier, 85% of us in the state of California use groundwater for crops or for drinking, whether it's urban or agriculture. So it's a critical piece of the puzzle as we move forward and steward these resources.
So you'll see on your screens right now a map that the Irrigation Association produced based on the 2013 Farm Ranch Irrigation Survey, which was released in 2014. Now we're looking forward to the new Farm Ranch Irrigation Survey, which will be taken this year, released next year. Happens every 5 years. But you'll see California's map is a lighter shade of blue. I'm very interested to see how that's going to be changed moving forward, because this survey was taken before the height of the drought and the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act taken into effect. And you'll see, even in the middle part of the United States, the Ogallala Aquifer is, again, in Nebraska, down to Kansas, to Oklahoma, into Texas. That aquifer is of utmost importance to irrigated agriculture in those areas. Some areas that aquifers are doing much better than others. But again, it just goes to show the importance of ensuring that groundwater is being managed appropriately. I think we're going to have a whole webinar on groundwater management, but we have 4 minutes left. I want to get into one last question, and I didn't want to leave without talking about technologies and practices and where the biggest opportunities are. So let's start with Jay. You look at both you being an irrigation dealer, you look at what the new technologies are on the market and how those technologies are being used, and how you and Irrigation Mart can assist your customers, the farmers, with their practices on implementing the most efficient technologies that are out there. Where do you think the biggest opportunities occur with these technologies are?
Well, for us in the Southeast, automation is proving to be one of the major areas for improvement on farm. A lot of our growers have always done things manually. So automation is a big part of what we do. Moisture monitoring, soil moisture monitoring specifically, is another area we see the adoption of all different types of products being used throughout pretty much all aspects of agriculture. That's even see it in some pasture ground or hay fields through the agronomic crops, which is your cotton, corn, beans, and then into your specialty crops like your fruits and vegetables and even pecans, your tree nut crops. The big thing that I think our industry needs and we're currently working towards is a way to integrate all of that into a easily manageable, complete system where the grower has the access to all the moisture monitoring data, all the weather data, and the control of the irrigation all in one component. Right now it's a really segmented deal, so he's looking over here at his moisture monitoring stuff, he's looking at this cloud-based deal for his weather, and he's trying to make this determination and then adjust his automation of his irrigation system. So as we do have some solutions that are coming around that are trying to be fully integrated, but I think that in itself is one of the major areas in which we're trying to bring a benefit to our growers, and I know some of our competitors and other dealers in other areas here in the southeast, central part of the country are doing the same thing.
Stephen, you have 30 seconds. Same question.
I agree 100% with everything Jay said, and then I'd like to just really briefly relate that to big data, IoT, and when these things are integrated and easily accessible, then we get actionable data that it can be a significant influence on our management strategies.
Paul, same question, 30 seconds.
I think the technology is going to help. I think we're a long ways from coming up with an integrated solution, as Jay said. I think our first priority should look at irrigation efficiency. For example, the state California, the average efficiency out here is about 0.7 or 70%, 30% variation within the field of how water and nutrients are being brought down, and it's because of design and maintenance of those systems. I think once we address those issues, technology will help us even that much further.
We are exactly at 3 o'clock on the East Coast. Guys, that was great. Thank you very much. For those of you attending the webinar, we thank you for bearing with us for the past 60 minutes. Hopefully we answered all your questions. If not, our information is on the screen. I encourage you to go to that website, irrigation.org/webinar_series, to view a copy of this webinar. We'll put it up in the next day or so, as well as our future webinars that we have. And we're looking to announce our next series here pretty soon. So again, to our panelists, thank you very much. For folks who attended, thank you. And we hope to see you on a future webinar. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.